I'm Will. I'm actually from Manitoba. I grew up in Selkirk, which is about 20 kilometers north of Winnipeg. Member of the Peguis First Nation, which is about 190, 200 kilometers north of Winnipeg. So Selkirk is the area where the St. Peter's Band of Indians lived before the land was legally surrendered in 1907. The people, including my great grandparents, were relocated to the Peguis Reserve, and that's where my grandmother was born and raised, and she's the woman holding me, the baby, in that picture there. So she ended up meeting my grandfather, who's the other person in that picture, and they raised their family in Selkirk. My grandmother, Ruth Asham, is a residential school survivor. She attended the Elkhorn Residential School between the years of 1924 and 1927, before she was, as she calls, rescued by other family members. My maternal grandparents are of Irish descent, and they lived in Nova Scotia. And so there's kind of a neat connection there where my father, who's the other person there standing with me in front of the University of Calgary banner, he ended up going into the Navy and traveling around the world. And he actually ended up meeting my mother in Halifax. So it's kind of a neat connection there. Probably a reason why I ended up living in Halifax, because I kind of would come here during the summers. And so I kind of knew how great of a place it was over here. And so it encouraged me to look into job openings when I was looking for a place at a university. So that's kind of my background, my childhood background. If you want to go to the next slide there, Chelsea, I'll just talk about my educational pathway. So like I mentioned, I grew up in Selkirk, Manitoba, sort of a rural town of about 15,000 people north of Winnipeg. Grew up there, went to elementary school, junior high, high school. From I was born in 1980, and I went to university in 1998 at the University of Winnipeg for my undergrad. Went there 4 years, did a Bachelor of Arts honors degree. During this time, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do for the first couple of years. I took courses in pretty much everything, and I gravitated towards psychology as I was really interested in just understanding the science of human behavior. Toyed with a couple of areas, but eventually settled on clinical psychology, which I thought was appealing. The idea of working with people, particularly in a therapy scenario. And so that's something I pursued, ended up getting accepted into the graduate program in clinical psych at the University of Calgary. So moved out there in 2002, did a master's degree, which was 2 years, and then a PhD. The PhD included a 1-year pre-doctoral clinical internship, which everyone who does a clinical psych degree needs to do before they're awarded their PhD. And I did mine back in Winnipeg at the University of Manitoba between 2007 and 2008. Now this internship, there's different streams that you can do, and I ended up doing a rural stream, which was really a great experience, where half the year I worked in Winnipeg and half the year I worked out in different rural communities, mostly around the Selkirk area. So my office was in Selkirk, but then I would go out to places like Gimli and Lebo and a few other smaller communities, and I would do mostly therapy with people in these rural communities. After that, I did a 2-year postdoc at McGill University, researching gambling problems in youth, and that's my research area that I'm most involved in. Throughout this whole educational pathway, which spans quite a long time, I was supported by Indigenous Services Canada post-secondary student support program. In this picture here, you see my university counselor, William Spence, from the Peguis Reserve. I was also supported by Inspire, which at the time was called the National Aboriginal Achievement Foundation. So maybe move on to the next one. So what do I do? Well, clinical psychology as a field is quite versatile. So initially, when I went into clinical psychology, I thought, I'd probably end up doing maybe private practice or working in a hospital or working out in a rural community like I had for my internship. But I found that I did not quite enjoy clinical work as much as I thought I would enjoy it, and I wanted to pursue other things. I was particularly interested in doing research, and so the good thing about getting a degree in clinical psych is, as I mentioned, it's quite versatile, where you don't need to do one particular thing. So I was fortunate to be able to go into academia and get a professorship, a tenure track position there. So I have done a little bit of clinical work as part of research studies, but I would mostly consider myself to be a professor. So the thing I like about being a professor is that you have a lot of freedom to do whatever kind of research you want. You can teach different courses, and you're not stuck, teaching the same thing year after year. So I've probably taught at this point about, I don't know, maybe 15 to 20 different subjects within psychology, which I have found pretty interesting. And a lot of what I do right now is actually developing new courses to be online, which is kind of convenient right now given the situation with COVID and how a lot of courses are moving online. Anyways, so that's a lot of what I do. I'm still doing gambling research. I'm also interested in social psych research, looking at how groups influence individual behavior, also how we perceive others, how they perceive us, and also just looking at things like risk taking. Why do people take unnecessary risks? Why are maybe people are overly conservative when it comes to probabilities? Those are the topics that really interest me the most. So I just think I have one more slide there. So I have this picture here because that's me in my office on my first day of my last sabbatical. A lot of people, I think, have the misconception that this is the typical day for a professor, whereas when you're not on sabbatical, it can be quite busy. When you're a professor, there are three main roles: teaching, research, and administrative work. Right now, I'm the chair of the Department of Psychology for 6 months, and I have found that to be pretty interesting as a new role, because there's all sorts of new challenges that I wasn't aware of that I'm now tackling. A lot of emailing, a lot of kind of putting out fires and that type of thing. But that's kind of a cool aspect of being a professor, is that from one year to the next, you never really know what you're going to be doing, and it's about adapting and just kind of taking on different roles and learning how to take on those roles as effectively as possible. So it's another thing I like about the position. So yeah, that's about all I have to say right now. I don't know if, Chelsea, you wanted me to get further into, like the differences between like psychology and psychiatry or anything like that, I could talk about that if you'd like.
Yeah, I was going to ask that question actually. Maybe if you just wanted to touch briefly on the difference between a psychologist, a psychiatrist, and maybe like a therapist.
Yeah, so, okay. So first I'll differentiate psychiatrist and psychologist. A psychologist is what I am, is someone who has typically a PhD in psychology. There's also something called a PsyD, and very similar training. One is a doctor of philosophy, one is a doctorate of psychology. The difference is just in the amount of clinical versus research components in your graduate degree. But effectively, on the at the conclusion, you have the same sort of opportunities. People who do a PsyD will typically be more likely to go into clinical practice, whereas someone with a PhD has more research experience, so they might be more likely to end up in a university setting. A psychiatrist is someone who goes through medical school, so they're a medical doctor, they have an MD, and then they specialize in treating mental health. So they would end up probably working in hospitals, maybe private practice, but they also are able to prescribe psychopharmacological treatments, so things like antidepressants and things like that. So psychologists don't prescribe medications. And so you asked about a therapist. A therapist is not a protected term. Anyone can call themselves a therapist legally and offer services. The term psychologist is a protected term. You have to, in order to practice, you have to get registered as a clinical psychologist to call yourself a practicing psychologist. Now, there's also something called counseling psychology. So those are typically 2-year master's programs that you take after your undergrad, and you can become a counseling psychologist. Those individuals can also become registered as well. There's all sorts of terms out there. There's like life coaches. There is just the word counselor with nothing beyond that. They all have kind of different requirements to become registered and what have you. So those are just something that you might want to kind of look into as possibilities if you're interested in mental health and the treatment of it.